Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the final session of the Conversation. My name is Yara, and I'm part of the Catalysing Change in Chemical Sciences project team at the University of Salford, and I'll be today with you in this session. It's a pleasure to see you all here as we close this webinar series. Thank you all for joining us over the past week. We've explored themes of confidence, belonging, and visibility and representation. Within higher education. Today, we conclude this series with an important and thought-provoking discussion. Our final session is titled Reclaiming Authenticity, Challenging Stereotypes and Power in Higher Education. We are delighted to be joined by Dr. Karisha Kimone George, who's a director of the EDI Research Centre at the University of York. Her work focuses on advancing equity, empowering minoritised communities and supporting meaningful institutional change. Please feel free to use the chat throughout the session to share questions and thoughts. We will return to them back during the discussion part. You can also engage via the Padlet link shared on the screen. We would love for you to leave reflections, thoughts and feedback as the discussion unfolds. And now, without any further delay, it's my pleasure to invite Dr. Karisha Kimone George here with me. Hello, Karisha.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, it's over to you, so enjoy your talk.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the talk. Thank you so much for taking time out to listen to me today, and I hope that you find it an engaging conversation. So essentially, I always like to start off talks with a little bit of a joke, just to get people, calm and ready and motivated to engage in some thought-provoking conversations. And this has been my favorite thing. Like, I love memes. I spend a lot of time looking through memes. And this one kind of epitomizes how I'm going through Lent so far, because I'm very much a snacker. From the hours of 3 p.m. to 4 p.m., no matter if I've eaten at 2:45, I feel for a snack. And so throughout Lent, whenever I go to the grocery, and I told myself, you don't need any more snacks, I always reach home and I'm like, we have 38 more days until we can get snacks. And so this utter epitomizes how I'm dealing with Lent so far. Okay, so just to generally give you an understanding of how we're going to go through, because I like to ensure that we're always on the same page. There are 3 types of subsessions, right? So the first one, I'll introduce you to the concepts that we're dealing with today, which is authenticity. And then I'll go through kind of the barriers that exist within current higher education that prevent individuals from being their full authentic selves. And then we'll end off with some pathways, some call to action, some things that we can do to kind of enable authenticity as we go through the long process of reducing those barriers. So let's start off with subsection 1. I hope everybody's ready. So just to start off with an understanding of authenticity to ensure that we are all on the same page. When we think about authenticity, you should think about the act of being truly oneself. So bringing your full self into the workplace. And this does not mean that you're not being professional. It's about an openness to and a welcoming acceptance of the complex dimensions of who you are. And so when you enter into your workplace, you feel like if you're still breathing just as much as you would be at home or outside doing something else. And it's things such as how you communicate, how you comb your hair, how you choose to dress, and even your lifestyle choices. And so I want us to all think about the extent to which we have been able to be authentic within our workplaces. And these are just some kind of thought-provoking questions for you to contemplate. So have you ever had hidden aspects of your identity, such as your sexual orientation, whether or not you have a disability, your nationality, or your faith, out of a sense of shame or fear? Have you ever given deliberately vague responses to questions such as where you went on vacation or how you spent your afternoons because you're aware that your lifestyle would not be readily accepted? And have you ever felt pressure to respond to a situation in a way that was misaligned with your core values, and yet you were unable to voice your opinion? And so from that, we get to see the extent to which each one of us might have found ourselves in situations where we were not able to be fully authentic. And so before we actually get started with painting or going through what prevents this authenticity within current higher education, we are going to first kind of think about what is the pillar, what is the thing that we're moving towards, what will enable authenticity. And authenticity will ultimately come from an environment where diversity is not just a token tick box. So we have diverse people, we have diverse voices, but what do we do with those voices? And so we have to focus on inclusion, to the extent to which diverse voices are valued and have power to generate change, but also equity, the historical systemic processes and procedures that have led and continue to enable prejudice and discrimination against marginalized identities. Are we making active efforts to dismantle those? And that comes from things such as being anti-racist and having pure anti-racist organizations. So not just saying that you're against it, but making active efforts to deconstruct it, but also recognizing the benefits of having diversity within your team and the increased levels of creativity, the increased levels of responsive decision making, things such as cultural capital that diverse voices bring to your team. And so these are about environments where cultural diversity is not only welcomed and appreciated, but embraced and expected. And so let's think about what is present within current higher education that prevents individuals from being authentic. And so to start off, I want us to start thinking about what is the prevailing or predominant culture that exists within current higher education. And the predominant culture, we have to, in order for us to identify that, we all need to come up here at the same place when we come to the understanding the definition of culture. And so that's what we're going to go through on this slide, right? So culture can be seen as the core and often intangible aspects of a particular group's life. It is about what we share and in terms of what we believe, how we practice things. So how do you come to do dressed? How do you come to work communicating? What is expected of you when you're in a conversation versus not just how you say it, but what you say and what is not okay to say. And that is around the ideas of what is typical and atypical. But more than that, it's about those beliefs, those shared values kind of impacting how we perceive people who don't behave in the typical ways that we have come to expect, right? And so it's about that in-group, out-group, and how we would then kind of treat people who do not fit into that norm. And so I want us to start thinking about within our own professional lives, within our own professional environments, what are those norms that dictate what we expect to happen with when we come to work. Now we can say that things have changed. I mean, especially if you're in your team for a very long time, culture and what's seen as normal might have changed to some degree. And there are two ways in which culture can change. So culture can change horizontally as time progresses, as team members, as your team grows, as the vision of your team changes. And so as society progresses or advances, or even it can regress. And also when new people enter your team with new ideas, those things tend to generate change. But generally, when we come to culture, culture still has these dominant pillars, these core pillars that remain resistant to change, and they tend to be strong and unwavering. So when we think about UK higher education culture, we would think about things that might have changed a bit over the time that we've been in it, but they're still generally considered as what is the norm. And before we actually go into kind of discussing what that norm is, I want us to introduce a new individual. So Katie. So Katie is a Black, asexual, neurodiverse female who comes from a rural village in Ireland and has had a very religious upbringing. During her time as an undergraduate and then PhD student at the University of Toronto, Canada, funded by scholarships, her main friendship group comprised international students from Japan, Africa, and the Caribbean, and she was the first in her family to attend university. So we see then that Katie's cultural mix. So here again, culture is the aspects of yourself and the groups that you have engaged in that determine how you see the world, how you interpret your experiences, how you engage with others. Right. So then Katie's cultural mix comes from multiple different groups that she has engaged in. So the fact that she's a minoritized racial background, she comes from a low SES background, she has a religious background, she possesses a disability and belongs to the LGBTQ plus community, but also she has engaged with friendship groups from Caribbean, Japan, and Africa. So all of those things are coming into Katie's cultural mix. And so when we're thinking about authenticity and Katie's capacity to be authentic, we now come to the big question of what is the existing UK higher educational organizational norm. So what is the majority culture? And I think for most of us, we can admit that it's still white, male, able-bodied, and middle class. And these things determine the extent to which we determine a great many different things, such as how we communicate, how we dress, what is okay to say, what is not okay to say, how we use our hands, how we're able to kind of tone our voice when to adopt when we're having different conversations. And these things tend to, when you come from different cultures influence the way in which you do these things. So for instance, in my culture, we use our hands a lot and we kind of get really, really, really excited and really loud. But one of the first things I learned when I came into UK higher education is that you don't point because pointing is considered rude. And so when I talk now, I have to put my hands in my pockets. And so that type of way in which I don't know, being worried about how you're being perceived because you're not doing things according to the norm. Those are the type of things that I want us to think about. But we'll go through some more dominant and more kind of pressing aspects of not being aligned with the majority culture in the next couple of slides as well. So let's go through what Katie will experience because she kind of differs from the cultural norm. And just a well-being check, because I want to ensure that what we're going to cover here might be pertinent to some people, but also some people might disagree, and just an understanding that lived experiences differ. And so it's just based on what the literature is showing that I'm bringing forward here, but this might be relevant to some people and not relevant to others. So we're starting off again from your own personal experience before we walk through everything. So I want you to think about whether you have ever been treated differently because of your cultural mix, and the extent to which that being treated differently then influences how you feel when you want to be authentic, and whether you feel capable of bringing your full self to your organization or to your workplace. And when we think about your cultural mix, think about things like your gender, your ethnicity, your sexual orientation, disability, etc., etc. Okay. So before we actually go into the different stereotypes and the different behaviors that influence someone like Katie, we have to understand where these stereotypes come from. Because I think when people start hearing about cultural stereotypes, they automatically think that they do not have any stereotypes, they do not have any biases. But what the literature strongly suggests is that stereotypes and biases are present without us even being aware of them. And they have been passed down across the generations unconsciously through social engagement, social structures. And so we might have stereotypes and biases that we think that we don't have, but that still unconsciously influence how we think about others and how we interact with others. And so we're just going to go through the psychology behind cultural stereotypes before we get into what these stereotypes are. So generally, a cultural stereotype is a belief that causes one to treat people differently based on the culture that they come from. So it's fueled by biases, so negative attitudes that are aligned with this person culture. And they emerge from stereotypes which are widely held, generalized, and often oversimplified beliefs about a specific group. They are often unconscious in nature, such that we may not be fully aware of all these stereotypes that we possess. And they emerge from a range of influences. So, as I mentioned before, social engagements, but also something like media representations. And they can be reinforced from negative experiences with individuals from these groups. And so, all stereotypes come from these biases, and they are kind of reinforced through unconscious processes. So, for instance, I grew up in Trinidad, which is a lower income country. And one of these stereotypes I think I still have, and I still have to actively fight against, is that white is superior. And that is because when you look at who had the access to the best education, best levels of resources, and who does have the most power within the country, they were always white. And so because not understanding the access to resources, etc., you think they got there because they're better and they are better quality, right? So that is a stereotype that has emerged based on engagement with just society on a whole. And this is how stereotypes tend to happen. And as we go through our lives, stereotypes then kind of automatically are reinforced. And this image here gives us an understanding of how that reinforcement happens. So in the center, we have these stereotypes. Remember, these stereotypes is there present under the surface. We're not even aware that we have these stereotypes in most cases. And stereotypes automatically impact emotions. And I know a lot of us might not understand that there's an entire psychological process behind the emotions that we experience. So, for instance, one of the cognitive appraisal theories that exist suggests that there is only one difference between whether you would experience sadness or anger following an experience. And so they're similar in terms of sadness and anger will be triggered when something you want you can't get, so something has subverted your goals, and it was something that was important to you. And the main difference between whether you would experience sadness or anger is whether you're able to identify the person to blame for you not being able to obtain your goals. If you're able to identify that individual, you feel anger. If you're not able to identify that individual, you feel helpless and you experience sadness. And so that is an automatic type of experience that we get, an automatic evaluation. And there's an automaticity behind our emotions. And so that helps us to understand how stereotypes can automatically influence our emotions. And those emotions then influence our thoughts and behaviors. And as we interact with different people from different cultures, they might reinforce those stereotypes, reinforce those biases, and thus that's how biases continue to prevail. And so we're going to go through some of the biases, and a lot of these biases are from history, right? And so we'll start off with the slavery and the end of slavery when we're talking about race, because that's when a lot of the biases kind of emerged. And so we have listed here about 4 biases associated with different ethnic minorities. So Black females are aggressive, and that essentially came from the fact that after slavery, a new form of Black female identity was emerging. So during slavery, there was the mommy stereotype where Black people were meant to be happy, cheery, motherly, taking care of the white slave masters' kids, right? And so if you ever looked at an Aunt Jemima bottle, that picture of that chubby, nice, Black, happy slave is essentially what the mommy stereotype was. And when slavery ended, those who kind of took on an empowerment type of voice, an empowerment stance, and wanted to fight for their rights, etc., they were termed sapphires, and these sapphires were automatically seen as contrasting with the mommy that was seen as acceptable. And that is how the aggression came to be known with someone who fights society or says no or goes against what you desire, right? And that's how Black females became associated with aggressiveness, especially if they say no to an individual. So Black men being violent and uneducated, that's again a kind of juxtaposition against 2 stereotypes, where the mommy version for the Black male was the Uncle Tom, who, in order to get opportunities, was demeaning, and was not demeaning, sorry, in order to get opportunities was also always of a submissive demeanor. And so essentially anyone who went against that Uncle Tom was seen as violent and uneducated because they were not as genteel and as easygoing with their language as the Uncle Tom stereotype was. When we come to East Asian individuals being hardworking and non-creative, hardworking is an association with the Confucian philosophy, which we associate still very widely with the East Asian kind of culture, where they see hard work as a virtue. And the non-creative is again what we associate with their culture, where we see that they come from a collectivist culture, and we associate collectivist cultures with the suppression of individuality and creativity. South Asian individuals being submissive is again emerging from the historical period where they were indentured, and so a lot of them came over as indentured laborers. And in order to get the best opportunities, they had to be submissive and take on a submissive demeanor. And so all of those things started off post-slavery and through the indentureship era, and a lot of them continue on. And that's how we still have those stereotypes continuing on, because of the social structures that continue to tell us that this is what we should expect. When we think about class, this is a stereotype associated with class where people think that people of lower class are lazy with a poor work ethic. And essentially, this comes from a belief that if you were hardworking, you'd be able to change your socioeconomic status and your socioeconomic standing. And so anyone who's not hardworking are the people who are still lower class. And that, again, kind of ignores the whole access to resources, etc., etc. And this is still something that is quite prevalent in society, this association with low SES, with being kind of lazy. When we think about gender, we see that women are not natural leaders, and women tend to, or should, with an expectation that they should prioritize their family over their careers. And so when we think about where this aspect came from, women not being natural leaders, we can associate it with the fact that being a leader is still seen as associated with what we see as male dominant characteristics. So things such as being assertive and things such as being decisive. And so for women to kind of be seen as leaders, they need to take on these type of assertiveness and decisiveness aspects of leadership. And the other one about women prioritizing family over careers, again, that is about the social consideration of the role of the woman as being the primary caregiver. And so it's expected that if a woman has kids, the kids will be the priority. And so they are less likely to be given kind of promotions, etc., etc. The LGBTQIA1 that was prevalent in the literature was about gay men being hedonists. And that emerged from this association with being gay, with this whole pleasure lifestyle and hedonism. And that was about the association between being gay and having HIV. And this was, I think it was emerging in the 1980s, where there were high levels of HIV among gay individuals. But again, that ignores the reality of the fact that gay men were more likely to find kind of safety in nightclubs. And across all nightclubs, there was unprotected sex happening, right? And so, but that association still occurs. And so we'll see, for instance, when we come to a couple of sites, that gay men are more likely to be given, like, to plan parties and stuff within the office. Okay, and this is our final slide of stereotypes. So the final couple of stereotypes we're going to look at is the religion and disability stereotypes. And so religious individuals being prejudiced and irrational. And this comes from the fact that religion is associated with religious fundamentalism, right? And it is because they are the loudest people who talk about their religion across the media, but also it's like that lack of understanding of the individuals that we see in front of ourselves, that reliance on those generalized stereotypes and biases. And so it's about the prejudice in relation to, for instance, we had a couple of years ago that Westboro Baptist Church picketed the funeral of a gay Marine officer. And so that's where the prejudice still kinds of, that's one of the instances where the prejudice still kinds of has been associated with being religious, but also irrationality, and again, in relation to religious fundamentalists being against kind of scientific theories such as Darwinism. And so it's about this unbelief that they can't engage with scientific logic and reasoning. When it comes to disability, we see it's about individuals with disabilities being incompetent or less competent. And that is again associated with our view as a society of what hard work entails. And so if they ask for things like adjustments or accommodations, that is generally interpreted as them not wanting to work hard at their jobs. Them being dependent on the support and care of others is again related to disability being seen as an inability to function independently. And so, for instance, you'll see that people would want to push someone in a wheelchair, even though that individual did not ask for help. Okay. So from those type of slides and that type of review, we should be coming to an understanding of the stereotypes that will emerge in some of our minds when we see somebody like Katie within our team, right? She will encounter stereotypes around race, disability, religion, and gender. And now we're going to look at what the impact would then be. Now, one of the prevailing impacts is the concept of microaggressions, which I'm sure most of you have encountered before. A microaggression can be defined as an indirect or subtle act of discrimination against an individual or group of individuals from underrepresented backgrounds. I know a lot of us have come across microaggressions, but what we might not know is that there are many different types of microaggressions. So Dr. Derek Sue, who specializes in microaggressions, argued that there were actually 3 different types of microaggressions: microassaults, micro-insults, and micro-invalidations. So microassault is a conscious and intentional action, slur, or insult related to a person's background. It might be subtle in nature, but the intent is always present. And so one of the micro assaults that we might encounter within the workplace is when an individual with disability asks for an accommodation or adjustment, they might be termed difficult or hard to work with, right? The other one is a micro insult. A micro insult is a verbal or non-verbal communication that subtly conveys rudeness, insensitivity, and demeans a person because of their background. Now, these can be unintentional, but the perpetrator might not always know that they're causing harm. One of the leading micro insults is assuming that an ethnic minority is an international individual. So the whole "where are you really from" type of comments that we tended to see happening recently. And then the final one is a micro invalidation. And these are communications that subtly exclude, negate, or nullify the thoughts, feelings, or experiential realities of another because of their background. And these can also be unintentional. And so, for instance, one of the things is when we had Black Lives Matter, and then people say all lives matter, or individuals who kind of deny that there's racism present in the UK, saying that racism is a US phenomenon. Right, and so we have all these different interpersonal discriminations that happen that lead to that lack of freedom in being authentic within the workplace. But what happens is that it's not just interpersonal. When microaggressions occur on a daily basis and stereotypes remain unchecked, they actually lead to structural inequalities, which we'll see on the next slide. So when we look at essentially the different, I went through the majority of these. So when we look at the essentially different kind of stereotypes, what we will see is that they can actually lead to structural injustices in how these individuals are treated. So religious individuals being prejudiced or irrational means that they're more likely to have their opinions and decisions undermined. East Asian individuals being hardworking means that they're less likely to be offered support. Women being seen as nurturing, they're more likely to be given the roles associated with supporting others. And we know that generally within higher education, those roles do not have a lot of promotional benefit to them. Lower class individuals being seen as lazy, they're more likely to be viewed as incompetent and so less likely to be given kind of high stakes opportunities. Individuals with disabilities being incompetent or dependent, they're more likely to be overlooked for more complex tasks. South Asian women being submissive means that they're more likely to be interrupted when they are speaking. Women being emotional means that they're more likely to interpret them being upset as an overreaction or lack of rationality. And Black individuals being aggressive or violent are more likely to get defensive when they're not differential. East Asian individuals being not creative, they're more likely to be overlooked for leadership positions. And there's something actually called the bamboo ceiling when we come to East Asian individuals. And gay men being hedonists means that they're more likely to be asked to plan the office party. So we see that we go from interpersonal discrimination to structural discrimination. And now we come to not just about that is the only thing that we want to think about when it comes to authenticity or when it comes to discrimination. It's about also the impact on the individual, because what happens is that we become less authentic because we start to do something called masking or cloaking. And masking or cloaking happens through a series of the different impacts that microaggressions can have over time. So in the first instance, they start to undermine our self-worth and our feelings of belonging within our different teams. And there's a new concept coming forward, such as called trespasser syndrome. And that's where despite despite working twice as hard as a minoritized individual to get our achievements and our accomplishments, we still believe that we will encounter microaggressions, that our positions and our qualifications will be questioned. Right? And that is a big kind of pull to our levels of self-worth and belonging. Whenever you encounter these experiences, you wonder if you are the voice for everybody from your background. And so that triggers the emotional labor and constant self-questioning. And over time, it can lead to guilt, exhaustion, and psychological stress. But over time, one of the main things that I think is important for us to note is that microaggressions can also lead to an internal strain with the accumulation of these experiences, eroding resilience and well-being just as much as major life events. And so naturally, to avoid this happening to us, what we tend to do is we tend to engage in something called masking or cloaking. So masking or cloaking is when you conceal the aspects of your identity to avoid further harm by fitting into the mainstream organizational culture. So you start to speak like white middle class, able-bodied males. You start to dress. You start to comb your hair. You start to have these specific type of vacations that is expected of you, etc., etc., etc. And over time, that masking and cloaking leads to an internalization of these historical prejudices. And this comes from an understanding of what we call labeling theory. So in labeling theory, what they argue is how we view ourselves comes from an interaction of how others see us and interact with us and our own definition of who we are. And over time, it is that interaction that leads to the internalization of these historical prejudices. Because microaggressions keep the historical prejudices ever fervent in our mind, in our professional realities. And so we do things such as Black people, because we're associated with being lazy, we tend to work twice as hard to avoid being aligned with prejudice. Individuals with disabilities, females tend to avoid disclosing any struggles or asking for assistance in order to disassociate themselves from the stereotype of being incompetent. Individuals with disabilities will not ask for accommodations to avoid being labeled as unwilling to work hard. And so it has the well-being impact, it has the masking and cloaking, but over time it then starts to have even more of a long-term impact on our level of authenticity, because it starts to affect our behaviors and our self-perceptions. And so we're going into now moving away from that educational aspect to figuring out how we can make things better. And that's our call to action bit. So I'm going to split this into two in terms of the role of allies, because not everyone comes from a minoritized background. Not everyone would experience kind of situations on a consistent basis where they're not able to feel like they can be authentic, but also from a personal responsibility for ourselves as individuals from minoritized backgrounds. Right, so from when it comes to allies, I'm going to talk about three aspects: so mattering, psychological safety, and accountability. And from a personal responsibility, I'm going to talk about psychological well-being. So mattering is coming out in the literature in replacement of something called belonging, which a lot of us might have seen, and which I have also used as a term within this talk. Belonging is where you're creating a space where someone feels safe, and with the priority being to provide that support, right? It's a supportive kind of space. But mattering goes further than that, because within UK higher education, if we focus on this need to belong, what happens is that we unintentionally increase levels of masking and cloaking, because for a minoritized individual to belong, we might feel that we have to fit into the norm. But if the shift becomes more towards mattering, where I'm able to be myself and who I am is seen and valued, that is where we reduce that capacity or that pressure to mask and cloak, and we increase levels of authenticity. So mattering is where you feel significant and important to other people. You feel like if you have an important role and that role makes value change to your organization, or your contributions are valued. So it's things such as someone takes me seriously, I have a voice, and someone is investing in me. So everyone can truly feel seen and heard, feel like if they matter when a team is characterized by accountability. I'll deal with accountability in depth in a future slide. But here when I talk about accountability, I talk about everybody, I mean everybody playing their role. So understanding that everybody has a responsibility to creating an environment where every individual feels like if they matter. And that is about everyone realizing that opinions are welcomed and all opinions are engaged with. Professional boundaries are respected and reinforced, and bias and prejudice are challenged. Right. So, for instance, another stereotype that tends to happen is that Black people are entertaining. And so there's a pressure when it comes to being a Black individual within higher education that you're meant to always be available to entertain. But if you are someone who does not like to be social, then that tends to create that friction, right? So that is about that respecting of those professional boundaries and realizing that, again, but because you see a Black individual, these stereotypes might not represent the actual lived reality. But also when things happen, and things might happen, things can go wrong, sitting down and having those difficult conversations and ensuring that behavior is improved in the future. So the second thing is psychological safety. And I'm sure a lot of you have come across psychological safety before. And that's a place where you're free to be yourself, but not just be yourself, to admit that you've made mistakes, ask for help and those type of things without feeling like you then are putting yourself out as incompetent. It's a place where you're free to learn and grow by asking questions. Right? So it involves welcoming, asking questions, raising concerns, admitting mistakes without fear of punishment or humiliation. And that involves seeing the individual as a whole and welcoming them to be their full authentic self. And one of the core kind of examples in which we can see this happening is if we take into consideration racial literacy. So a couple of the research projects that we've done within the research center has been exploring people's experience or their views on the use of this term BAME. And what has happened is that this differs based on which group within that BAME umbrella you're talking about. So, for instance, home students tend to really despise that word. They do not like that word at all, and they prefer words such as person of color and global majority. Whereas international students, they tend to love that word and they feel that that word represents who they are. But again, we're seeing that within this type of complex area of race, it's about kind of seeing the individual as they present in front of you, trying to see what they want to be identified as, and using the terms that they want to use when reference to them, right? So it's about an inclusive language. And when we ask the individual, what would you like, rather than imposing what we think they would like, that is the first step towards psychological safety. And the final thing for allies to keep in mind is about accountability. And as I said before in the previous one, the mistakes will happen, right? So being accountable is not just about kind of ensuring that mistakes are dealt with, but also developing that level of self-awareness where you understand or you spend the time figuring out what your biases actually are, what are your existing stereotypes, and putting things in place where you keep that check to ensure that your stereotypes are not being reinforced, that your stereotypes are being dismantled. And then monitoring how they manifest. So do you engage in microaggressions? One of the microaggressions that goes quite unnoticed is mispronouncing ethnic minority names. Do you ask someone how to pronounce their name before you pronounce it? Do you mistake different people? Like, do you mistake international students for one another or international individuals for one another because you think they look so alike? Right, so those type of microaggressions are simple ones that we can kind of start to keep track of when we're engaging with others within our teams. And then the final slide, the final take home is about this personal responsibility. Now, I'm not saying that it's going to happen automatically, because I think that what we have on here is two definitions of psychological well-being within the literature. And psychological well-being, to reach that core, is a lifetime kind of journey. And the literature actually shows that people with the highest levels of psychological well-being are the elderly. The lowest levels of psychological well-being happen in mid-adulthood, and that range differs based on whichever country you're dealing with. So some of them, in China, I think it happens quite early, whereas in Russia, it happens quite late. And so essentially, this period where we're in, this mid-adulthood between 35 and let's say 55, that is when there's the lowest levels of psychological well-being. And as individuals who might struggle with being authentic within our workplaces, it's about taking that time to, number one, dismantle that internalized racism that we might have within ourselves. Number two, to empower ourselves to speak up against it, create or enable that psychologically safe environment to happen. By valuing our voice, we value others, we will enable others' voices to be valued as well. But also ensuring that we don't have that pressure to mask and cloak by taking off those masks and taking off those clothes. And what we have on this slide here is kind of the ultimate finalization of having that high level of well-being, right? So there's several, but I chose the two that I think were most pertinent. So according to Rogers, to have the highest levels of psychological well-being is to be a fully functioning person. And that's characterized by increasing openness to experience, increasingly experiencing existential living, and that's living fully and authentically in every moment, and increased trust in yourself, so that congruence of who you are as an individual, and an increasing experience and acceptance of your feelings, so that self-awareness. And the second one I have on this slide is from Zezin, so about self-compassion. And they argue that for you to say you have high levels of psychological well-being, you must be compassionate towards yourself. And that's having a positive and caring attitude towards yourself in the face of failures and shortcomings. And so that brings me to the end of the presentation today. And I hope that it has helped you to understand ways in which you can be authentic.
Thank you, Karisha, for your presentation. And while we wait for questions from the audience, I would like to start with one question. In your work on EDI and power structures in higher education, what are some changes you believe institutions still need to make to create genuinely inclusive environments?
So I think it comes from two different areas. So essentially, the first one is the structure in terms of how do they make it clear that EDI is important to the institution? Do they have, for instance, I know some higher education institutions have a senior leader who has that as their main priority, EDI, whereas others is just an addition to their general kind of overall title. And so when you make it clear that this is important, when you make it clear that even at the higher levels we're taking this seriously, when you have bureaucracy that makes people accountable, when you have an EDI strategy where there is auditing within that strategy to ensure that there's funds allotted for that, but also resources in terms of personnel that can actually put things in place. I know a lot of things within the universities now is about Athena Swan and race equity, but what the research is actually showing is that those are things that are just, there's no auditing to ensure that that actually makes a difference on the ground. And research is showing that it does not actually make a difference on the ground. So one of the things that's actually happening is that minoritized individuals are put in charge of these, and the impact of fighting for something that is so personally relevant is such a long-term negative well-being impact that it's actually having more of a negative impact than a positive one. But on the other hand, it's about ensuring that education is mandatory. So as the EDI Research Centre, we developed a cultural awareness training program in order to educate people around microaggressions and give them ways in order to keep those checks and balances in place. And within across a range of institutions, this type of mandatory training is not actually present. So that's one of the things that we're trying to change in terms of how are you ensuring that people engage in it, and how are you checking and auditing that their practice is actively being changed? Where is the responsibility for this?
And we now have some questions from the audience. I'll put them on the screen for you. So as a Black woman, having listened to your presentation thus far, I'm seeking guidance on how to effectively challenge these issues without inadvertently reinforcing the harmful stereotype of the angry Black woman.
Very good question. Thank you, Dorothy. Essentially, I have struggled with this as well, and I delved into the literature in terms of the best way to do it. And I think the best way to do it is to come from an educational point of view. So keep firm in the belief that what you are saying is important, and that person needs to hear what you are saying, but also challenge it in a way that you are using the processes that are at your disposal. So in some cases, the individual might not listen to what you have to say, and you ensure, because that, how do I put it? I always look at George Floyd and what happened with George Floyd and the fact that there was this police officer who felt that he can get away with it. And that would not have been the first time that he's done something, not as grave. He would have done small things beforehand and no one challenged that individual. And if we don't challenge people, they get the confidence to do more and more and more. And so I understand that we don't want to be the harmful stereotype of the aggressive Black woman, and there's a way in which you do it. In terms of remaining in that professional stance, making sure you check the personal relevance to this, making sure you deal with that personal relevance so you don't get emotional in that situation, making sure you know about the professional leeways that are at your disposal. So there's things like mediation, formal grievances, etc., and ensuring that you give people the educational resources that is important to them. So sending them an email with, this is something that you said, this is what I think you're not aware of, here's some links for you to consider in your own time, but also letting their managers know that this has happened so that they can check in on that individual, if that makes sense.
Oh, that's a great answer. We've got another question from Akansha. Do PhD students and early career researchers feel empowered to challenge systems?
No, that is the quick answer to that. They don't feel empowered. And I think that is one of the things that we're trying to change. We're trying to make it that the key person in those situations is the supervisor. The supervisor determines the attitude that person will adopt throughout their academic career. So one of the things that we're trying to do is we're trying to develop a training for supervisors where they understand their role in empowering the PhD students, empowering the early career researchers that work with them in order to get them to get that courage to challenge the status quo. Because let's think about it. Them being there is already challenging the status quo. And so they have to get that power to remain there. Don't leave academia like a range of our minoritized PhD students and ECRs are doing, but also to challenge things when they actually happen.
Amazing. We've got a lovely comment from Julia. I'm going to put it on the screen for you. Thank you so much for an insightful talk. You've given me lots of things to reflect on. Yeah, actually, we've got a lot to reflect on. And we've got thank you from Fatima. And if we can take perhaps as a final question, if there is one message you would like students to or early career researcher listening today to take away from your talk, what would it be?
I think the main thing would be to have the courage to be authentic. I spend the majority of my academic life kind of masking and cloaking. And I think that the final thing that broke the straw that broke the camel's back was when I had sent out an email to students within my department as the well-being champion. And I was using like 1 or 2 words of dialect. And I was emailed by someone telling me that they didn't say it in this way, but between the lines, it said that I needed to speak the Queen's English. And that was the last time I masked and cloaked in my department. After that, I was like, no, because the more that you mask and cloak, the more that you make it okay for microaggressions to happen, the more that you make it okay that the people who are coming after you feel they need to mask and cloak. And masking and cloaking has such a negative impact. It's taken me years to figure out exactly who I am because that is just what I was doing. So essentially taking care of yourself means that you challenge the status quo, means that you find the courage to do these things, means that you find the courage to be your full self in your workplace. And I hope that is something that you find the courage to do.
Also, we've got a very awesome comment from Pinky. Thank you, Pinky. And yeah, we can wrap it up here, dear Karisha. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for your time. It was a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you. So much. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. We are closing this webinar, so thank you so much for all the speakers, and thank you to everyone who joined and us to contribute to today's discussion. Over the past week, we've created space for open dialogue around confidence, belonging, visibility, representation, and navigating academic and professional pathways in chemical sciences and beyond. This series may be concluding, but the work and the conversation absolutely continue. If you haven't already, please do share any final reflection on the Padlet link that's shared in the comments. Your feedback is really valuable for the ongoing project. Also, the full series will be available on our website. On behalf of the team, thank you all for the speakers across all the sessions again for bringing part of the for being part of this series, and we hope to see you in future conversation. Have a wonderful rest of your day.